Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Lighthouse this afternoon. We are broadcasting live from MoAB's bunker in Davie, Florida, and brought to you by the Let's Live to Tell Foundation. I am your host today, MoAB, and I have a very special guest, Guy Drab, from the U.S. Army Garrison in Miami, supporting headquarters of the U.S. Southern Command. Today, we are going to be talking about what you need to know about post-traumatic stress. And we are going to give you the tools that you can take with you and start practicing immediately. Guy, take it away.
All right. Usually when I give these briefs, one of the first things I do with a group is ask the question, how many of you have made it this far through life and not experienced stress? And of course, no hand goes up because the fact of the matter is none of us get through this life without stress. It's something that begins at the very beginning. And in fact, if you think about your birth experience, we all lived at that point for 9 months inside of what many people would describe as the Garden of Eden. In your mother's womb, you don't have to work for anything. Everything's provided for you. Food is provided for you, air, oxygen, nourishment. And you're completely shielded from any kind of abrasion, any harm. The temperature is always just the same, a nice comforting sound of a heartbeat in the background. And then at one point, somewhere around the 9th month, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little later, but something very traumatic happens. No one asks your opinion on anything. You suddenly find yourself being pushed down a tunnel into a bright explosion of lights and sound. If your eyes could focus, you would see a huge being standing in front of you, compared to you, Sasquatch, wearing a green mask with a pair of stainless steel pliers wrapped around your head, pulling you out of that place that you've had for security for the first 9 months of life. Then to add insult to injury, this person produces a sharp metal object that to you would look like Excalibur, cuts that part of you that has bonded you to your mother and provided everything that you've needed for survival up to that point, ties it off in a knot, and then hangs you upside down and slaps you around. And in fact, every single one of us comes into this world in a New York City mugging. Fortunately, we don't mostly remember that, but it is something that causes us to have our first real experience of life, which is to cry. We scream, we cry, and then if we're fortunate enough, we discover that actually works. Someone holds us, they hold us at their breast. We hear that same comforting sound that we've heard for the first 9 months, and we relax, we're nourished, we're fed, we feel good, we've experienced the idea of being loved and comforted. That causes us to relax, we go back to sleep, and then we wake up covered in human excrement, our own, behind bars, and we discover that the only thing that really works for us is to scream and cry again, and then we repeat the cycle. Early life kind of goes on this way until we figure out that this is what life is about, and it's not all that bad. There's stress, there's comfort, there's relaxation, then there's stress again. And every day kind of proceeds that way. At my age, and I'm pushing 70 right now, and having spent 10 years in the Army and 2 in the Marine Corps and 14 in the Navy, having retired back in '97, and now 20 years later, I'm preparing to retire again, this time from civil service. And I've discovered that with each passing year, just waking up is a shock to my system again, experiencing new pains in new places that I didn't even know I had places before. The day kind of begins that way. It seems to then progress. Things begin to get a little bit better. The panic of getting the dog taken care of, getting food, taking care of the things that need to be taken care of, going off to work, meeting the challenges, and then coming home completely exhausted from everything that went on, and at the same time feeling good about having met some of the challenges, being concerned about some things that yet lie ahead, and also looking ahead to the great retirement. Ultimately, every single one of us is going to have ups and downs in this life. It's the roller coaster experience of life, and there are stresses, challenges, and then opportunities to rest and regroup. Sometimes, however, those challenges become something more than what we've ever even figured could come into our life and occupy us in ways that just go beyond any imagination or any kind of experience that we've been taught about before. Sometimes we're ill-equipped to deal with that, and not always because we don't have the capability within us. Sometimes those situations are just overwhelming and would be overwhelming for anyone. When that happens, sometimes it becomes difficult for us to reach that state of security and normalcy again. And when that happens, it can be very helpful for us to know a few things about what it means to be human, what it means to have traumatic stress, and what we can do about it, and where we can find help. That's become kind of my life occupation for quite a while. In the service, I started off at West Point, graduated in 1970, caught the tail end of Vietnam, and coming out of that experience, found that life was a little bit different than what I expected it to be. Found that it became important for me to know how to manage aspects of my life that I hadn't figured on even experiencing, let alone managing. Through time, one of the things that certainly helped me was faith. And coming out of Vietnam, I had a faith experience, and that caused me to leave the military, to devote my life to ministry and go off to a seminary to study to be a minister, a pastor. In the process, I discovered that West Point is not considered to be one of the better seminary preparatory schools, and so the school asked me to do an additional year of work at graduate level, and it actually gave me an opportunity to take everything that the psychology and counseling departments had, as well as some other classes and courses that were foundational. It prepared me for some of the things I began to encounter, but after pastoring for a period of time, I had the opportunity to come back into the military as a chaplain. I'd always figured on being an Army chaplain, but the Creator has a sense of humor, and so I was sent to the Navy. And first assignment, 2 years with a grunt battalion of Marines out of Camp Lejeune. We went through jungle warfare training, mountain survival training, and had a wonderful opportunity to grow and experience life with the Marines, and then off to the Navy, and over the next 14 years with the Navy, ended up on nuclear submarines. But in the process of going through these experiences, Uncle Sam was very good, sent me back to school, ultimately 3 times for 3 master's degrees. And while I was at Princeton, Theological Seminary, was able to get a degree in counseling, and that allowed me to come back into the military and right away find my skills put to use. From that point on, within the military, anytime there was a rash of suicides, that became my next assignment. And there I had an opportunity to work with a variety of people in a variety of situations. Even submarine squadron was the result of a chief of the boat committing suicide on board a nuclear submarine just a few days prior to its deployment. That experience and working with those people, as well as the experience throughout the military, began to help me to hone a skill set and acquire a gift and a talent, I guess, a calling that's not something anyone aspires to in their youth. I don't think anybody figures on someday growing up to become a subject matter expert in suicide, and let alone have to deal with it for some time. Nevertheless, in my current position with the U.S. Army Garrison in support of Headquarters U.S. Southern Command, although my primary responsibilities have to do with drug testing and drug education, drug prevention, and alcohol abuse prevention, we've also picked up the responsibility for the suicide prevention programs and the employee assistance programs. And so through that, again, there's been opportunity to keep my pulse on the latest that's been coming out with regard to suicide in the military, new things that we're learning. Additionally, I'm also a licensed mental health counselor and a certified EAP. And again, those skill sets are things that have helped me to have perhaps a broader perspective and a different perspective than perhaps many people might have as well as open up the opportunity for other experiences. Now, having said that, one of the things that very often happens when I give these transition assistance briefs to folks who are getting out of the military every quarter is that I'll find that usually it's about 2 weeks after I've given a presentation, I'll have someone show up at my door and knock on that door, poke their head in, and it can be anyone from a E3, private first class, Lance Corporal, all the way up to an 06. And they'll look in and say, "Chaplain, have you got a moment?" When that happens, it changes everything. And then they'll come in and they'll tell me something. "Sir, I want you to know that I've got PTSD. And it's been affecting my life. It's been affecting my career. I saw you. And in fact, 3 times while you were giving our presentation, I saw you begin to have an episode. And then I saw you work through it. I saw you keep going. I want to learn how to do that." Well, that's something I'd kind of like to share with you today, what it is that I learned, what it is that I put into practice, what's worked for me, and what I've been able to share with others that's made a difference for them. Now, having said that, I think the first thing that it's important for us to realize is that everybody's different. I was actually working as a hospital chaplain when I was at Princeton, at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, Manhattan. And as part of a clinical pastoral education course, I was called to go up to the neurological ward. I'd gone through the tunnel system underneath the hospital over to the psych tower. I got into the elevator and I was standing behind 2 doctors, one a young intern and a Marcus Welby type old gray-haired grizzled veteran doctor standing next to him. This young blonde blue-eyed strapping young intern looked at the old doctor and he said, "Doctor, that stuff that they teach us in medical school about this part of your brain does this and that part of your brain does that, that's not really true for everybody, is it?" At that point, the old doctor didn't even bother to look at him. He just kept his eyes straight ahead and said, "Nope, everybody's different." And then the young man looked at him again and he said, "But doctor, then why do they teach us that in medical school?" And the old man looked at him for a moment, looked away and said, "They got to tell you something for your money." It was an eye-opening conversation standing behind them in the elevator, but over the years I've discovered everybody is a little different. We've had different experiences in life, and one of the things I learned working in the maternity ward is that even babies at the moment that they're born are different. If someone were to drag their fingernails down a blackboard in the middle of that incubation center, you would find some babies would look up and become attentive. Some babies would ignore it. Some babies would begin to giggle, and some would burst out crying. Right out at the outset, we have different skill sets, different capabilities, and then as we go through life, we learn things and things change. Now, for most of us, and in fact, for all of us, stress and stress reaction is something that's a part of our survival technique. As a matter of fact, if we look at the animal world and even for people, we talk about the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, which is our response to some kind of immediate threat. And in fact, if a tiger were to walk into this studio right now, we would have one of those responses. In either case or any of the 3 cases, there are certain things that happen. There's an immediate pump of adrenaline, and that's to get us ready to either tense our muscles and freeze, or to take off running as fast as we can, or to fight for our lives against whatever that threat might be. Once it's done, As far as other animals go, they suddenly realize that the tiger isn't after them, or they were able to outrun the lion, or whatever the threat might have been. You'll notice if you watch enough of the Discovery Channel that they suddenly go into relaxation mode. They go back to eating grass and doing the things that animals do. Humans are a little bit different. We have a little bit more in the way of our brain, and it causes us to begin to reprocess over and over again those things that were a threat, wondering how it is that we can avoid that in the future, what we can do differently, playing it over and over again in our head, and every time that we do, recreating that entire stress response. Over a period of time, and unless we're able to somehow break into it and relax, we find ourselves becoming numb, or we find ourselves becoming overly agitated to the point where we look for something to calm us, something to block those feelings. Too often we turn to alcohol or we turn to drugs, and that works short term. Unfortunately, it doesn't develop the long-term skills, and it puts us at some risk. The primary reason that it does is because there is something also that is on our side that separates us from the rest of the animal world. If you look at the human brain, the front part of it is called the prefrontal cortex. In the average human being, 1/3 of your brain is prefrontal cortex. It's kind of like the boss. It's the parent. It's the executive function that controls everything else that's going on. That prefrontal cortex, and being 30%, is rather unique in the animal kingdom. Our next closest animal relative is either the bonobo or it's the chimpanzee, very closely related. And in that particular species, only 11% of the brain is prefrontal cortex. That's why a chimpanzee can look intelligent, look smart, be very bright, even use tools, and be cuddly, almost like a little baby. But piss it off and it will rip your face off. It can be a very, very violent animal and have a hair-trigger temper. If it feels threatened, you're in trouble. In the average dog, 7% of the brain is prefrontal cortex. On the other hand, though, dogs are kind of special. Out of the entire animal world, it's the one that developed in relationship with human beings. There's some truth to the fact that it is our best friend. And the dog actually is the only animal that looks directly at a human face and then lets its gaze focus over on the left side of the face, because that's where we show more emotion. And they read our emotions. They react to that. And so a dog is all the time reading you and reacting to your emotions. Now, a cat is only 3% prefrontal cortex. Basically, a cat has memory, and it knows what it's feeling now and what it feels like doing. And beyond that, there isn't much. And so to go on stage with full-grown tigers and lions is something that's kind of beyond my comprehension why someone would do that on a regular basis. If you think about it, when we use drugs and even alcohol, that immediate sensation that you get of relaxation and feeling good is, number one, a release of a neurotransmitter called GABA that helps you to feel relaxed. In fact, something that I find that helps me to get good sleep at night is to take a tablet of something called melatonin with GABA, G-A-B-A. It's a natural substance, but it helps you to relax, helps you to be on a light sequence and rhythm for falling asleep, and is really a very helpful little natural sleep aid. It's something that, by the way, we all need to have better sleep and more of it in order to give the brain the chance to regroup and recover. Now, this GABA, or this reaction that allows us to then feel that relaxation, unfortunately goes to the next step. And the next step is the alcohol and certain drugs also begin to paralyze the prefrontal cortex. It affects the external portion of the brain and the frontal portion first. And so it turns off that part that says, you know, you really ought to stop at half a beer or one beer. It turns off that part that gives you better insight over where you are and what's going on around you, and the control that you need to have to better govern yourself and keep yourself out of more dangerous situations. The other thing that it does is prevent you from being able to get into that deep cycle sleep, and also sometimes the REM sleep that you need to experience at night, so that sleep can help your brain recover and prepare itself for the challenges of the next day. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is there's a physiological side to helping yourself deal with stress that has a lot to do with diet, sometimes supplementation. It has to do with sleep. It has to do with exercise. And so taking care of yourself physically is something that's very, very important in being able to deal with stress. Now, when I ask human beings, how do you project yourself into the world? Usually I find that one of 8 categories is mentioned at least once, and sometimes more than a single, well, usually more than a single category. But people think of themselves as physical beings. They talk about themselves as, in comparison to other people, as being bigger, stronger, more physically able to do this or that or the other thing with this physical skill or that physical skill. They talk about themselves as being more handsome or less beautiful. And so we have a physical identity. Then beyond that, we also have an emotional identity. We think of ourselves as people who are either happier or sadder. We think of ourselves as people who are more depressed or less depressed. But we have an emotional identity in a way that we kind of see ourselves compared to other people. Then we also have an intellectual self, a way that we kind of project ourselves into the world, and the way that we perceive ourselves, very often through the eyes of others, as being smarter, less smart, better educated, less educated, knowing certain things that other people don't know. And so we have an intellectual self. Sometimes we see ourselves as maybe having less education, but more common sense, sometimes less. I remember I had a young woman who was a long-distance truck driver and had severe difficulties in relationships and in expressing herself. She was actually brought to me by her family, but also came willingly, and we did a series of psychological tests to help me know where to begin to talk to her and kind of share with her what was going on and let her tell me a little bit about it. I saw so much damage for this person that the one place I felt like I might be able to start was the one place that came out very normal, very average. She had average intellectual ability. She had average intelligence. She had an average ability to be able to figure things out. And so I decided to start there, and I said, what this tells me is that you have average capability. You're just like everybody else, and you're just as good as anybody else in terms of your intellectual capability, how smart you are. And immediately she burst into tears. As she stood there in front of me, just bawling her eyes out, I thought, oh my God, maybe she was telling herself that she's actually smarter than everybody else and no one understands her, and that was her coping mechanism, and I just destroyed that. And so I backpedaled for a moment and I said, well, this test measures how at least you are in terms of intelligence. You could be smarter, but this tells me you can't be any dumber than average. And she looked at me and said, you're telling me I'm average, I'm okay, I'm just like everybody else. All my life, my parents and other people told me how stupid I was and how useless I was, and I couldn't figure anything out, and I was stupid, and you're telling me they're wrong.
Wow.
That little piece of information that told her how she was okay, in intelligence, ability to exercise abstract thinking ability and figure things out, began to transform her life. And no matter where you are in any of these categories, somewhere there's a trigger, somewhere there's something. And if you have the ability to wake up in the morning, you've got the ability to seize control and get help in that area, discover your potential, and overcome these difficulties and these problems. Now, besides the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, we also have a relational side, and it's how we relate to other people and the primary relationships we have, and we tend to identify ourselves compared to other people as having more friendships or better friendships or less friendships, or more people like us or they don't like us. These days, a lot of it all has to do with electronics and how many Facebook friends you have, and that's not really life. That's not really living. And so it's very important for people to kind of move beyond that. I always try to encourage people to get real relationships, face-to-face, looking at each other, particularly for women. If you ever notice women when they're talking, generally they're face-to-face, eye contact, looking at each other, touching each other, and if that's not happening, then they don't feel like they're communicating. I've noticed that men, and I'm guilty of this myself, when I'm sharing something very deep and very personal and making myself very vulnerable with other men, usually what we are doing is sitting side by side, playing with something in our fingers, and every once in a while looking at each other face to face, just for those moments of punctuation. And we're more comfortable that way, doing something with our hands. And so very often this creates some difficulties in male-female relationships and finding ways to support each other. It's, very often folks can mistake the fact that someone from the opposite sex is not relating to them in the way that they feel like they need to be related to as a failure. And that's not always the case. Things are very, very different between us. And the way that we communicate, by and large. And again, there's always exceptions to the rule, like the old doctor said. Everybody's different. We all fall somewhere on that bell curve. But relationships are important to us, and we need those one way or the other.
People need people, Guy. We need people, and with technology today, it's making it too easy to lose that face-to-face contact. You know, I talk to people and they say, oh, didn't you see my post on Facebook? Didn't you see what I did? And I said, no, I didn't. But I would have loved if you would have stopped by and told me about that situation.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, the media, Twitter, Facebook is all fine for beginning a discussion, beginning a conversation. But ultimately, the things that really matter are those face-to-face conversations and the things we share together with people. And by the way, that's something that becomes very, very important to military people. Very often we come into the military looking for some kind of a relationship that we have not had growing up. There's a gentleman named Stephen Pressfield. He's a former Marine, and he's written a book called The Warrior Ethos. And in that book, he talks about the fact that today, 10% of our culture is actually being expressed in 100% of our military population. And he talks about the differences between the world at large and people within the military. He mentions the fact that in the world and in popular culture, the concept is to be what you want to be, and don't let anybody tell you who you are or what you can be. Be yourself, and be free and independent. And if you look at the kinds of things that folks get together and ascribe to, it's freedom, individuality, and becoming famous, becoming well-known, becoming rich. And then when we talk about things we're going to brag about, you can go downtown and sit around and listen to discussions of professionals sitting around on the patios outside of large professional buildings in downtown Miami, and you hear discussions about, oh yeah, you think that's a good golf score? Check out this golf score. Or, oh yeah, you think that Mercedes is nice? Check out my new Lamborghini. Or, oh yeah, you think your wife is pretty? Check out my mistress. I mean, the discussions are all about who's got the best, who's got the most. Sit around and listen to a group of paramilitary, police officers, firefighters, and military members bragging. And the discussion goes like, oh yeah, you think that's bad? Wait till you hear what I lived through. And whoever has the most horrific experience of life is somehow the winner. And the value system is duty, honor, country. It's belonging to something bigger than yourself. Marines, death before dishonor is the motto. And so when you consider those differences, it's a real challenge, especially for those who are reservists, who find themselves with a foot in both worlds, suddenly finding something very different when they go off to war, when they go off into a military setting and form bonds where people are really struggling to stay alive, struggling to make it through difficult times, supporting each other as family and as team, and then to come back and suddenly be broken away from that, pulled out of that setting, and cast back into corporate America, stocking shelves here or there, or working on this law case or that law case, performing this type of occupation or that kind of occupation, and their heads and minds still being back in those relationships that meant so much to them. It becomes something that is difficult to describe to other people. God only knows. When I finished Ranger School and came back for the first time and went home, I was talking to my friends who had just completed colleges. There was no way in the world to talk about West Point as compared with a normal college experience back in those days. And then when they asked me what I had just done, I said, well, I just finished airborne and Ranger training. And they said, oh, you're going to fight forest fires? Well, no, actually, we tend to start them. And so it's something that's very difficult to describe, and it's difficult then to just pick up a conversation with folks who don't share that same kind of a common background. And so to become part of the military, and particularly to be about to leave it, or to suddenly be broken off of the relationships that you've had in a particular unit, and then find yourself plunked down in a recruiter's job or some other kind of position, is really rather traumatic, and it takes some adjustment. Relationships are very important. Now, to move on, a fifth area in which we express ourselves beyond relationships and identify ourselves beyond relationships is spirituality. And there it's really about relationship, but it's about who we are compared with most other people in terms of our relationship with something higher than ourselves, something bigger than ourselves, something beyond ourselves. And what does that mean? How does that then translate into my relationship with a body of similar believers? How does that translate into a supportive relationship with a church or with some group of people who share that same spiritual value system that I do? And am I able to find support of that nature? And the fact is, we do need spiritual support as well. And then beyond that, we also express ourselves in terms of our careers. If we haven't got that far in life yet, we express ourselves in terms of our education. And we identify with certain schools or certain modes of study, certain degrees that we might get. even high schools. We identify also in terms of our recreational activities. And I'll ask folks, when you don't have to do something, what do you find yourself doing? And to express ourselves in terms of our hobbies, those things we enjoy doing, that's also something that brings us into relationships with other people. It gives us a sense of belonging. It gives us a sense of value. And then finally, the eighth area in which we kind of express ourselves has to do with those things that we commit our financial and material resources to. How do you spend your money? Where does it go? How is it being used, and what does that say about you and what's important to you? So across those 8 areas, some people, to one extent or another, have found ways to express themselves. Sometimes they're stymied. Sometimes they feel like a failure in one area and then just kind of zoom in on that one area, and it can make them feel like a failure in life altogether, when perhaps they're actually doing well in some other areas. But sometimes fear really causes us to withdraw or hide behind something that we know is not true, and ultimately separates us from other people. Many years ago, when I was still at West Point, I was the soloist for the Glee Club, among other things, and had a chance to travel around and actually do a lot of performing and be on stage with a lot of performers. Once actually got Bob Hope angry at me. Had an opportunity to be on various television shows and radio shows. And when I met the entertainers, one of the things I discovered about a lot of people who go into entertainment is that they're very, very insecure, and insecure with themselves and who they are, and very often feel very isolated. And part of the reason is because they felt that way, they found a way to express themselves in the world that other people loved. So they honed their act. They came out on stage and they sang the great songs. They sang or they told jokes, or they did whatever it was that caused people to applaud and made them feel great. And they walked off stage feeling like, yes, I did it. People love me. I've been accepted. And then within just moments of that pinnacle of success and feeling like they belonged and that they had a place, suddenly the applause would fade. The next thing they realized is that what people were applauding was the face they put on, the act that they had, and nobody really knew them, and they were alone. And people only related to them by virtue of that act or that position. And they would withdraw into a shell. It made it very difficult for a lot of them. Sometimes we don't have to be famous to do the same thing. We become fearful. And fear is that driving force behind that stress reaction. Now, PTSD is a very peculiar kind of stress reaction, and not everybody gets it. Only about 10% of our folks who go through the same situation actually get post-traumatic stress disorder. We all experience post-traumatic stress, there's no question about that. But some of us, because we've been exposed to it for an entire lifetime. And unfortunately, many people coming into the military have come in and they are trying to get behind them a lifetime of abusive neighborhoods, abusive relationships, situations that were very difficult for them, and looking for something different. And then suddenly they find something different initially, but then they're exposed to more stress and more difficulty. And then if it creates a difficulty for them in being able to actually function at their job, then they're put out of the military. And then they feel like failures. They become disconnected. And it can become a very, very difficult wall to climb, to get over. And so it's important to realize that folks who are primed for that, when something triggers that post-traumatic stress disorder, and for me, even as I've been sitting here talking, I've relived a couple people and a couple episodes from my own life that have triggered my response. And immediately it begins a cascade at the back of the head, a certain part of the brain, of almost a slideshow of all the bad things that can happen and did happen, the sense of failure or the sense of pain connected with that, and it actually stimulates that fight, flight, freeze response. There's something that we can do about it. And the thing that I found very, very helpful in my own walk has been a practice called mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is addressing kind of that intellectual, emotional side, but it's also touching on that relational side and the relationship with yourself. I found a wonderful book in Kinko's one day. I had actually learned something about mindfulness while sitting in a doctor's office many, many years ago. And I had picked up a medical journal, and at the back I found an article that kind of stimulated my interest. It was called Unmindful Mindfulness, and talking about a program that was being conducted and research on this approach. And in this approach, there are certain skills that people, if they practice, actually stimulate activity in the prefrontal cortex, help them to become able to then control those other aspects of the brain, especially those that have been overstimulated by the stress response, and to be able to then manage it. It was a number of years later, after I'd picked up bits and pieces and tried some of the skills myself and found that they worked, that I found a perfect complement to my experience. And there I was standing in Kinko's a number of years ago, and there on the shelf I saw a book. It was called Mindfulness, 8 Weeks to Peace in a Frantic World, written by Danny Penman and Mark Williams. I picked the book up, and as I began to thumb through the chapters, I realized that each chapter was related to a week, and that week was a set of skills that you could practice in the privacy of your own home, but even better yet, in the company of someone else trying to learn the same skills. And as it allowed people to work together and learn those skill sets, it gave them an ability to control that stress reaction. It worked for me. And I was glad to share it with a number of people who came back to tell me the same thing. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we did was encourage a group of people, even in my current position, to come together at noon and form a little support group where first they went through the book, learned the exercises, practiced the exercises together, and they continue to meet religiously now, almost 2 years later, every week, to again support each other and help each other. This kind of thing is very powerful. One of the keys in mindfulness is awareness. It's training yourself to become aware of your stress response the moment that it begins to happen, and immediately then to take control and kind of step out of yourself. Look at the experience, look at what you're feeling, look at the reaction, but without judging it. And simply to look at it and as you would a cloud moving across the horizon and say, oh, there's that thing again. And then to kind of look at it and then refocus. Okay, now where was I and what was I doing? And then kind of move yourself right back into it. It takes some time to practice that, 8 weeks. And, oh, by the way, that kind of corresponds with the physical part of behavior change. Back when I was at West Point, for years I had wrestled. And I was on the intramural wrestling team at the academy and did that for 2 years. And then was ineligible to do it again, and so they switched me to the boxing team. And the boxing team was, you think it's same thing, fighting in a squared area, but no, very different. And the very first time I saw my opponent come at me, he dropped his left hand, leaned forward. My response was immediate, a wrestling response. Prepare for a double leg takedown. Both hands went down to my waist. My legs went back. He caught me with an uppercut and laid me out on the floor. I realized this is not a real good experience and not one I want to repeat too often. And so I tried to get off the boxing team, but they wouldn't let me. So I was left with trying to figure out what to do about it. And in the process, I analyzed what it is that he did and why he did it. Now, he dropped his left hand and leaned forward, expecting me to throw a right hook, which was leaving my chin vulnerable for an uppercut. At the same time that he brought the uppercut, he would parry off my right hand with his left hand coming up. Now, I never threw the right hand, but the effect was the same. Now I know what he is trying to do, and so I want to think, okay, then if he's going to do that, I want to pretend to throw the right hand and instead throw a left hook, and that should catch him. Now I know what to do in my head, but my body has got years of experience in doing something different, a very different reaction. So how am I going to deal with that? Well, I got to get a friend, somebody that's going to come and help me out. That was my roommate. And we would go to the boxing ring each day after class, and we would practice that move. It was awkward. I couldn't do it. But little by little, starting in slow motion, we looked like a couple ballerinas out there. Eventually, it started to come quicker and quicker, and it just happened that I drew the same person 8 weeks later in another fight. This time, he remembered what he did last time. He did it again. Totally different result, and I felt so much better about it. It takes 8 weeks for us to develop the nerve pathways that create a habit that can give us an alternative to the habits that we've been doing that create the problem. But we have to have a plan. And it helps to have a partner to help us work through that. We have to believe, first of all, that it can work. And in fact, research shows us that it does. And then we've got to work at that habit. We've got to practice it until it becomes second nature, just like the other habit that was counterproductive. That's why you can't stop a bad habit of a bad way of thinking, a bad way of reacting. That's something physiological, emotional. It's there with you for life. You can't pull those nerve cells out of you. You can't pull out the boutons. You can't pull out the dendrites. And if you do, you'll be a vegetable. But you can learn to use a different pathway. 8 weeks, eating the right things, B vitamins. One of the things that we've learned in military research is that folks who oftentimes commit suicide are folks who don't have enough B vitamins in their diets. And we also recognize that they don't get enough omega-3 fatty acids in their diets. Both of these things are essential to the development of brain tissue and nerve tissue. And if you're trying to build successful alternate pathways, it's important to give your body what it needs. You need adequate water. You need adequate sleep. And again, you've got to practice. It just takes some time and doing the right things. The other thing that's important, and I've mentioned this over and over again, is again, a good supportive network. And so what I would want to recommend to you is that first and foremost, you look for friends who are going to help you to achieve goals that are different than the ones that you've been exercising, and you've got to sit down and figure out, what is it I really want to be? What is it I really want to do? What's going to count in life overall? One of the final questions I ask in these seminars that I do when I'm talking about these 8 different ways we express ourselves is to say, okay, these are the 8 ways that you identify yourself compared to other people. How would you like to see yourself in those same 8 ways compared to other people? And this kind of sets up 8 goals, perhaps, in each of these same 8 areas. But then I'll ask one big question. What if all of a sudden the ceiling just opened up? A bright light came down from above, illuminated you sitting there, and you heard this voice. And this voice said to you, I'm the one that made you. I made you for my purposes, and I made you for a purpose. But I'm giving you exactly 10 years from this moment. 10 years, not a second more, not a second less. And then suddenly, the ceiling closed up. The light went away. You began to suspect that maybe you shouldn't have had that pizza late at night. But then you realized you didn't have a pizza late at night. And maybe this was real. If you thought that it was real, what would become the single most important thing that you would want to do or become so that you could feel like it was worth it to be here? And that becomes an integrating purpose for everything else. Everything else gains its definition and meaning from that. Now, generally when we're young, it's very difficult for us to come up with that. As a matter of fact, another thing that we've discovered within the military is if there is a personality trait which is linked to suicide, it is this spontaneity, this impulsiveness. Well, if you really think about it, impulsiveness is a lack of prefrontal cortex. And, oh, by the way, your prefrontal cortex is not fully wired to the rest of your brain and body until the age of 25. Ever wonder why automobile insurance rates drop dramatically at the age of 25? That's why. Before the age of 25, that prefrontal cortex is not fully operational, and you don't have control. I always tell senior NCOs and officers who are above the age of 25, if you have troops working for you who are below the age of 25, you are their prefrontal cortex. It's important for you to understand that role and understand the difficulty they're going to have in exercising that over themselves. And you've got to help them develop it. And so it's important for us, especially if we've had a lot of impulsive behavior even in and of ourselves, to realize we're not stuck with that. We really can change that. We can stimulate prefrontal cortex. Now, the ways that it can be done, I've already mentioned mindfulness. It's a practice where we know from MRIs and from other types of examinations that have been done that the prefrontal cortex lights up when one practices mindfulness. Amazingly, the prefrontal cortex also lights up when someone is practicing meditation or really trying to focus on accomplishing some kind of a difficult task that requires them to set aside their immediate feelings and impulsive reactions to get this thing done. And the other thing that causes the prefrontal cortex to light up is prayer. Amazingly, those are the things that actually stimulate prefrontal cortical activity. And so challenging yourself to learn new things. A little exercise I like to do each day is find a moment, instead of taking a smoke break, turn on my computer and just pick something off the Wikipedia page and start traveling through the links to learn something new that I didn't know about something absolutely irrelevant to my life that suddenly takes on a whole new meaning for me when I discover that, hey, that really does relate to some aspect of my life. It's about learning how we do fit in to the big picture. And ultimately, Erik Erikson talks about the last stage of life as being integrity versus despair. And what he's talking about is either we have learned how to be one with ourselves, with our past, with our failures, our successes, with where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Or we find ourselves living only despair. That oneness is something that we can push toward, learning more about ourselves, learning more about others, sharing with others, and sharing especially the things that we learn from our own experiences. So, in a nutshell, taking care of yourself physically, watch your diet, omega-3 fatty acids. Make sure that you get good rest. We really do need about 8 hours, 7.5 to 8 hours a day. You have to have a couple periods of REM sleep, but even more important, deep sleep. In deep sleep, there is something that I describe as a sprinkler system that comes on in the brain and literally flushes the area in the brain and around the brain, removing the toxins and dead cells and helping to restore its function for us. Very important to be able to get to that point and to be able to experience that. It's important to surround yourself with positive people and positive things, and it's important as well to find ways in which you can encourage others and provide a basis for positive change for them, support them in trying to achieve the positive goals that they have. And so, in a nutshell, those are some of the things that we've learned, some of the things that work, some of the things that we know, and hope that's been helpful for somebody out there.
That was wonderful, Guy. Thank you so much. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things when you were talking about surrounding yourself with good people. What I talk about a lot is an accountability partner.
Mm-hmm.
So, you get with somebody that has walked in your shoes, that has shared the same experiences as you. And when certain thoughts go through your head, or you think to yourself, maybe I'm not thinking right. So you can call your accountability partner and run that by them, and you can have a conversation and you can get that release. For friends, for somebody that is suffering severely with post-traumatic stress, I had talked to you earlier, Guy, that, at one point, somebody can have post-traumatic stress very severely. They can be hypersensitive, hyper-reactive, nightmares, they're not able to sleep, angry, outburst of rage, road rage, all of these things. And that puts a burden on the family.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to address a little bit issues with the family. And I hear somebody coming, and I have a feeling my mic's not working. It's not working good? Not loud enough? So I wanted to talk about tools or things for the families to be aware of. And let's start with, for example, when your military comes back from service and he comes home and you notice a change in him. And, the family, maybe the mothers, why can't you be like you used to be? They might say, what do you mean you don't like to do that anymore? What are some things that you would tell these mothers and these family members when they notice changes in their loved one? What are things that they should not be saying or they should be saying?
Well, one of the first things that we need to be aware of is that we all have a fear of anything unknown and a fear of those things that are difficult for us to control. And particularly if a loved one has been away for a period of time, during the time that they've been gone, there's been all sorts of thoughts going through our mind about how this is going to have affected them. Are they still going to love me when they return? Am I going to have the same role as mother or as wife, as child? And so that's actually a stimulus for this fear, that begins to create an anxiety response in the family member. And so that kind of reaction is something that's very real. I remember after I had made a deployment with the Marine Corps, I was in Okinawa. In my life, I had never worn polo shirts. Never wore polo shirts. Always wore button-down shirts, button down the front, or T-shirts, one or the other. And then when I was in Okinawa, button-down shirts just weren't that comfortable. A friend of mine was wearing, and working with the Recon Marines, was wearing polo shirts, and so introduced me to polo shirts. I started wearing polo shirts, didn't give it another thought. And then I came home with polo shirts, put on a polo shirt, and my wife at that time went absolutely crazy that I had somehow changed, and this was a threat that I had become somehow more free and was a different person than the one who left. Now that's not an unusual reaction, and so it's not just for the family member to recognize that that's going on and that's happening. It's also for the service member. But it's important to remember too that your service member has been through some very intense life experiences, and those do create changes in the way of doing things, changes in the way of thinking. It can be something as small as wearing a polo shirt, or something very pronounced, like suddenly making sure that anytime you drive the car, you swerve well to one side or the other to avoid anything that looks like it could be an IUD on the side of the road, driving under low-hanging tree limbs, or avoiding driving under low-hanging tree limbs, and you're wondering what's wrong with them. These are things that are going to happen, and it's very, very important, I think, for family members to actually themselves become engaged in talking to other family members, become part of a support group themselves that can help them kind of work through some of this, and understand that there's going to be changes. If we don't change in life, we'll all still be running around in diapers. We would have tried to crawl back into the womb, and it would have been a traumatic experience for Mom. Life is about that change, and we need to learn, all of us, to not embrace fear, but rather embrace life and embrace life change, hopefully in positive directions, although the negative is going to be a part of that as well.
Guy, I just wanted to share a tool that I created, and anybody can go to my website and find it, and they can download it. And this is a simple tool for the family and friends of anyone that has post-traumatic stress. It's a code. It's very simple. What's my code? And I can give you some brief examples of this. When I was out with my son and something would happen, I would wonder. I was always wondering, did that bother him? And I simply could have said, hey, Johnny, what's your code? He could have said, code green, everything is okay. So that takes the pressure off the person with post-traumatic stress and off the family. Other times, maybe, you're in a movie theater and maybe something on the screen triggered your loved one. All they have to simply say is code yellow. They've become triggered. They're feeling anxious. They're irritable. They're angry. They need to go home. They need their space. You can't ask them why. You can't take it personal, and you can't get mad. And then I've added one part to this. And call their accountability partner. Find out who your loved one's buddy is. Who is it that they reach out to? And most times than not, it's going to be somebody who has experienced the same thing that they have experienced. And if we can get to our loved ones when, in code yellow, get them, hooked up with their accountability partner, this can keep them out of code red. And code red is when you see your loved one's behavior change. maybe they're not sleeping, they're sleeping more or sleeping less, they're drinking more. You see them start to disconnect from life, and these types of behaviors can lead to suicide. And again, you want to get them hooked up. And if it gets to a point where you think it is serious, of course, you would call the professionals in. And I just wanted to state there is no shame in post-traumatic stress. The only shame is the silence of it. June is PTSD Awareness Month. We want to spread the word. We want to get information out there. I don't know, Guy, is there anything else that you want to say to wrap things up?
Well, I think you emphasized really the most important part right there, which is staying connected, both the family as well as the service member. And perhaps in your immediate situation, there is not someone that you can really feel you connect with. Even as a licensed mental health counselor, I realize that everybody who comes through the door into my office is not somebody that I'm going to be able to relate to or who is going to be able to relate to me. On the other hand, there's somebody out there that they can relate to, and somebody as well that I can relate to. And it's very important for us to find out whoever that is and to have that kind of connection, and also to have them connected with those people who are the primary and first responders in my life, my family, and the people that live with me on a day-to-day basis, to keep them aware and connected in as well with those who are providing that help. And so, we normally do this with the doctor. Very often, if we have something that's going to require surgery, we make sure that our wife or a husband or a family member or a friend comes with us to those doctor's appointments so that they know what they need to do to help. And if there's something wrong, then they know which doctor to call to get us connected up with that person that can help us. And ultimately, this is not a bad thing. This is not a basis for shame. It's actually about widening our sphere of relationships, widening our sphere of influence, bringing into our lives more people that we share with as well as who share with us. And in that unity, we find a great deal of strength, and in fact, we find our purpose in life.
I wanted to mention a couple more things.
I knew it.
But one thing is very important regarding post-traumatic stress. And I don't know if you could briefly touch on it, or I'm going to make a comment and see if you have a response. People who have post-traumatic stress, there's something about it that lies to you. And it tells you that you are worthless, that you're nothing, that you're not loved, that you would be better off gone. I'm telling you, it's an absolute lie. And Guy, what is it about PTSD that tells these lies to their brain? Because it's not true.
Okay, it's not just PTSD. The fact of the matter is, all of us hear voices. And I'm slippery ground here as a mental health professional, talking about this to some extent, and thank God for the research of Dr. Robert Firestone a number of years ago, who wrote books about dealing with the inner voice. And in fact, if you ever watch any of his taped counseling sessions, it looks like a case of demonic possession, with the person yelling and screaming back and forth, sometimes speaking for the voice and then answering it back. But the fact of the matter is, we all have voices in our heads, and they're all talking to us. Now, some people are going to claim that that's crazy. Some people are going to say they're spirits, and I certainly don't dismiss that. But whether it's spirit, whether it's something just between our ears, it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is, those voices are there, and very often they're condemning, very often they're defeating, very often they're putting us down. And it's very important to learn how to talk back to those voices. Something that I've learned to do very often when I'm talking to folks, I'll pick up on the fact that they're very ashamed and afraid to talk about these voices they hear. And sometimes I'll broach the subject by saying, you hear voices and they're telling you things that make you feel bad and make you afraid, or make you try to tell you or get you to do things that you know are just wrong. And very often they'll look at me and say, you know about that? How do you know about that? I was afraid to tell you, but you know about that. And my response is, yeah, but here's the thing. You just need to understand they lie. They're liars. They're not telling you the truth. And so you're going to hear them. They're going to be there. But you just need to know they're liars. What would you say if I told you something that you knew was an obvious lie? What would you say to me? You'd call me a stupid liar, and you wouldn't listen to another thing I said. And you would use that as a basis to break our relationship. Well, sometimes we got to do the same thing with those voices inside our head. They're going to be there. It's part of who we are. It's part of life. One of the things that Firestone noted is very often, he said that many people reported that those voices sounded a lot like their mother when they were being nagged and growing up. I don't know if that's necessarily the case for everybody's mother to be that way, but the fact of the matter is we have those voices. Sometimes it can be helpful to ask yourself, okay, who does that voice really sound like? But also recognize that voice isn't really telling you the truth. And you are something more than what that voice is telling you. It's nice if you can learn to hear that still small quiet voice, one that speaks to you outside the cave of your own mind and encourages you and lifts you up. With SEALs, there was a phenomenal dropout rate going through underwater demolition training, the basic BUDS training. And they tried different methods to try to help more and more SEALs be successful in getting through that training. And they tried better selection of candidates. That didn't work. They tried this, that, and the other thing. And finally, somebody came up with the idea of, let's teach them how to deal with stress. And, that worked. And they taught them 4 points. These 4 points were, number one, to not focus on trying to be immediately successful. Going through underwater demolition training, don't focus on being successful in getting through the training. Focus on the immediate event, on what's in front of you right now. Laser focus and concentrate on that. Number 2 was learn to be able to see yourself being successful even in the darkest hour. Number 3, and this is what we were just talking about, that inner voice. And I watched this in my little granddaughter. She wasn't quite 2, tiny little thing, and we were at a funeral, family funeral, and she walked up to this huge overstuffed chair in the funeral parlor, began pulling on the arm and trying to get her leg up, and I could see her little lips moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying, so I bent down close to her to hear. And as she's pulling on this huge chair arm, I hear this little voice saying, "I can do it. I can do it. I can do it." And eventually she pulled herself on the chair, and then she just sits there going, "I did it. I did it. I did it." And just like that, SEALs are trained to focus on the positive talk. Learn to have positive self-talk. Learn to compliment yourself. Learn to encourage yourself. It's the little engine that could. And very, very important. And then, of course, the 4th thing that they learned, and really I should mention this, there are 2 systems in your body over which you have a degree of control and also no control. And if you learn to access them, they can help you deal with an immediate feeling of stress. The first is breathing. If I ask everyone who's listening right now to hold your breath, you can do that. If I ask everyone who's listening right now, hold your breath for 30 minutes, you can't do that. And as hard as you might try, you will pass out and then begin to breathe. It's just going to happen. The fact of the matter is, we do have a degree of control because it's part of both our parasympathetic nervous system, as well as that aspect that both the part that we can control and not control. And so, SEALs are taught 4x4x4 breathing. Breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, and do that for 4 minutes. And just practicing that degree of control over your own bodily functions actually helps you relieve stress. If you think about it too, what's your stress response? Fight, flight, or freeze, and breathing is a part of that. In either case, what I'm probably going to do is hyperventilate. And I'm going to do that to get more oxygen into the muscles to either fight, run like hell, or to freeze and not breathe. The moment the threat is gone, the very next thing I do is and in fact, when I do that, I immediately feel a sense of relief because it's a signal that my body just sent to my brain, oh, the threat must be over, or I wouldn't be doing that. And so breathing is an important part of also managing stress. And then the other system that you've got, there's a nerve. It's called the vagus nerve. It kind of meanders from your pelvic floor through your body up to your brain. And this particular system is connected with your bowels. Now, if you think about it, how often have you heard stories about someone who was in a very traumatic situation, and then when it was over, they had a bowel movement, or they peed on themselves, one or the other? Not that uncommon with folks. On the other hand, if the tiger were to suddenly walk into this room, neither one of us would be looking for a place to have a bowel movement at that moment. Everything tightens up and prepares us to run first and then have our bowel movement. So if you squeeze your pelvic floor and hold that for about 5-10 seconds, like you're trying to hold yourself back, and then let it go, it also relaxes the entire system. And I get a spin-off benefit. I'm not sure why this is, but it also opens my sinuses. It works like Dristan. And so I'm very grateful for that. Now, I might mention, too, that there are some new things in research that are being done. The Army is looking at paying for a study right now to see if it's worth it. But they have a theory, and it seems to at least have some support, that if they inject an amount of a particular Noperin, I believe it is, it's an anesthetic, and if it's injected into the right side of the spinal cord around the cervical spine, it actually has an effect of canceling the PTSD response, and apparently resets the nervous system. Now, we're not exactly sure if this is going to work, and from my experience as someone has had PTSD for a period of time, I would tend to believe that it's probably not going to work in and of itself, because there is that learned behavior, that practiced habitual response. There are neural pathways that actually need to be changed, that need to be worked on and adapted into new and better ways. But this is another area that gives some hope. Might be something that works. And I might say that that's a key word too, hope. I work together with a psychologist, wonderful doctor, Dr. Marlon Chris Wolf at Southcom. And Chris has a set of brain measurements, breathing measurements, and uses them as a biofeedback measure to actually show people their success in being able to control their stress responses and relax. And simply by showing someone that you do have the ability to be better, feel better, and get better is to give them a sense of hope. And there is nothing more important than that. Giving someone a sense of hope, and hope is best served on a plate of relationship.
That was a perfect segue into what I was going to say next, Guy. Relationships, and again, connecting with people. I don't know if many of you are aware, but we have here in Southeast Florida the Buddy Up, and it's the fourth Thursday of every month, and it's actually going to be June 22nd. This is our Facebook page, and you can see here it says Let's Buddy Up Davy. This is next Thursday, June 22nd, 7 o'clock, 7 to 10. It's an evening of food, fun, and camaraderie, connecting with other military first responders. It's free, and it's a great time, and it's a great way to build community. I think that is about it for our show today. I wanted to thank you very much, Guy, for coming and joining us. You gave us some great information. I always love listening to you. And I wanted to let everybody know that he was speaking about Dr. Chris Wolf, and Dr. Chris Wolf is going to be on our show next Wednesday, the 21st at 7 p.m. And he is going to do a great presentation on how PTSD affects the brain. And it's going to be a great informational show. And one last request is that you go to my YouTube channel called MoAB's Bunker and subscribe. And when we broadcast live, you will get notifications. On MoAB's Bunker, we broadcast live with the Lighthouse, which is my show, bringing great information to the community. And then we also have another one for our grunts out there called 3 Drunk Grunts. And actually, they're going to be in here tonight, and they're going to be going live at 7 p.m. So I hope you tune into that. In the meantime, I wanted to again just say good day to everybody. Thank you again for tuning in. Oh, and go to the website letslivetoTell.org, and we'll see you soon. Bye. So I hope you tune into that. In the meantime, I wanted to